Time now for the Daily Answer, sponsored by Salem Surround on The Answer Now TV.
What actually is on the table in this Ukraine peace deal?
Yes, we wanted to hit that. We've talked about Ukraine a lot this week, but we wanted to just actually lay out what everyone is talking about. And I especially wanted to because I think this peace deal you've heard about is one that Charlie would have liked a lot, and he would have been a big fan of it. So there's this 28-point plan. This is what came out a week ago. And then there's been efforts to modify it where Europeans have proposed counterplans. But I think the nicest thing is the 28-point plan because it seems this was worked on by the administration directly. And so point one, it says Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. And okay, that's a formal one. Sovereignty confirmed. That is a fancy way of saying Ukraine will remain a country. It will remain independent. It will not be annexed. It will not be absorbed by Russia or anybody else.
State.
It'll remain a country. And it then says, and point two is actually one of the most important. It is, there will be a comprehensive non-aggression agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. And then this is key. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. This is why I was a fan when I read this plan, that the intent of this is to be a final peace treaty with no outstanding business. And when we've seen Europe try to mess with this, a big way they've tried to mess with it is by introducing ambiguities back into it. So an important part of this plan, one of its components is it would cede land to Russia, more or less. Let's put up that image we have.
122.
Yes. And so 122, is it up yet? Yes, there it is. And so what it would do is those areas in red are roughly match places that are currently held by Russia that America, the international community have considered part of Ukraine. And these are the places they've captured. Crimea in the south, which is now covered by our Chiron, but Crimea was taken about a decade ago. These others were taken during the invasion. This would formally cede them to Russia. It would now be owned by Russia. We would acknowledge it as Russian territory.
That's the key.
That is the key part.
They were previously and have always been a part of Ukraine.
Not always.
Well, so they were part of Ukraine at its independence. So Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. And so when they became independent, they took all those lands. Russia has had claim on some of, generated claims on some of them. There's been a long source of conflict. They invaded over the status of many of these territories, and that is roughly the area that they have conquered by force of arms. And this deal would recognize those captured territories as Russian. That's part of the removing ambiguities thing.
So was Russia's initial intent to take over all of Ukraine or to take these?
Well,
people would debate it. Russia's stated intention for invading Ukraine was to denazify it. They claimed Ukraine was run by Nazis. That is highly debatable as an assertion at minimum. But it does seem their initial plan, they attacked directly towards Kiev, the nation's capital. They literally had paratroopers land at the airport of the city. They seem to believe that Ukraine was a very weak country and would just collapse almost instantly once attacked. And in fact, if you follow the news story, then a lot of Americans expected the same thing. The Biden administration seems to have offered, Zelensky, you can flee the country and just come to America. And Zelensky, I will say to his credit, did not do that. I know Charlie and many has had a lot of criticism of Zelensky on justified grounds, but he did not. And they fought a lot harder than they expected. So I think one reason Charlie would support this deal is he would probably believe Russia would be inclined to respect a final peace settlement because this war has been a lot longer, a lot bloodier, a lot more expensive, a lot rougher on everyone than was expected. A lot of wars are like that.
So is this a win for either party, or is this a pretty mutual compromise?
I'll try to take the Charlie thing and say the biggest winners of all would be the Ukrainian people who are not conscripted and fed into a meat grinder so that Washington can feel good about themselves and how they're fighting Russia and being tough on Russia. We don't need to kill a bunch of Ukrainian 18-year-olds so Lindsey Graham can feel tough. Having said that, the peace deal would be seen, I would say, as a victory more towards Russia because it is better for Russia than the deal that was on the table before the war began, that Russia was offering to us.
What were they offering?
Russia's deal that they were proposing in early 22 was essentially if you agree that Crimea is part of Russia, because they'd already occupied that, if you agree not to admit Ukraine into NATO and not position certain military forces close to Russia, they were proposing a peace deal along those lines. So it would have had them have less land, and it would have involved fewer concessions than this agreement would have.
Why does Russia not want Ukraine in NATO?
So the most helpful way to think of it is Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, is has long been a part of their country. That Russian culture began in Kiev, and it was part of the Russian Empire for hundreds of years.
You're reminding me of Tucker's interview with Putin.
Exactly, yeah. Tucker asked Putin about Ukraine, and he gives this literal half-hour answer about the history of Ukraine. But the core of it is from the Russian perspective, they see Ukraine as this core part of Russia. And so it would be, imagine if America had a really devastating thing and New England broke away and became its own country. And obviously, we have a lot of political differences from New England, so you could see how they'd possibly be happy to be independent from us,
or Texas.
But we would all, but I wanted to go with New England, where America began.
Sure, yeah.
And then imagine China came along and was suddenly cultivating New England as an ally and talking about adding them to the Chinese Belt and Road bloc. And maybe we should put some military forces in New England. We could maybe put a nuclear missile there. And I think even though we would see a lot of political differences with New England, it's full of all these insane libs and commies, we would still be really upset by that.
It's
I think that's the best way to understand.
It's sort of like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, which...
More extreme than that, because we've never owned Cuba.
No, but Cuba being so close to us, we had this Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s because Russia was positioning arms right on the... in Cuba, which is what's the
90 miles to
90
Florida
miles
is
to
what they would say.
And that was a huge geopolitical issue of the time. This is when kids were in schools were learning to get under their desks and having to do these nuclear fallout drills. So that the boomer generation remembers this, and so it's sort of akin to that, where you could imagine having a hostile military force, NATO, which is considered one of the most robust, well-funded military alliances in the world. It's probably the most robust. Having that at your doorstep is not a very promising or delightful idea for the Russians.
So when they say that they are basically they're covering all, I think you said, conflicts over the last 30 years, putting those to rest, that means then that Russia, they would be at peace with the parts of Ukraine that they have gotten back.
Yes.
And
they would be saying, we will not demand anything more, and we in return we would end the sanctions, we would reintegrate Russia into the global economy. The objective of the peace deal would be a true peace deal, not just a ceasefire, not just we stop shooting, that this is considered the resolution of the conflict. And I know Charlie very badly wanted that. He thought it was dumb that we were in this new Cold War with Russia going on forever when we have conflicts with China, for example. I think he viewed this as a distraction and a product of Washington being unable to move on.
An absolute waste, by the way, of American taxpayer dollars and munitions.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel. Stay informed anytime, anywhere with the Salem News Channel and 9:30 a.m. TheAnswer.com. This has been The Daily Answer, sponsored by Salem Surround on The Answer Now TV.